Just remember this. In this country, they drive on the wrong side of the road.
Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Welcome to the channel if this is your first time. This is a very specific video that is two things. It's doing two things. So the first thing it's doing is it's acting as a response video, a companion if you like, to a video that Brian from Bookish did recently. So as I'm filming this, he did it a few days ago. So this is not going up straight away, so it will be more than a few days when it goes up. But a few days ago, Brian from Bookish did this video, which was 11 recommended books on American history. It's a really good video. It's a really good channel. Everything he does is brilliant. I always think his videos are so good. And this was a really good insight into some books you might want to read if you want to learn more about American history. So I thought it would make sense from my history background and because I've got lots of things I could recommend, that I could do one on British history. So the first purpose of the video is a response to Brian's. The other thing is I'm also a co-host for the Historathon event this year, and as a co-host I thought it'd be a nice video to put up. I've done a few themed videos for the Historathon, and some of the books that I'm going to mention have been mentioned before on my Historathon videos, but there's lots that I haven't mentioned, so we'll see how we get on. And there's a lot of videos here. Sorry, there's a lot of books here. So Brian mentioned 11. There's more than 11, but there's so much you can talk about with British history. It's very difficult to whittle it down to 11 books because you know what you're going to cover. There are some things I haven't included. There's only a little bit of Scottish history, which is just purely by accident, and I haven't done a lot of top-down stuff. So in general, most of the general public, certainly when you talk to general public who say they love history, they usually love two things. They either love military history and World War II and all that, and battles, or they love the Tudors. Battles and World War II, or the Tudors. So they either like reading about how horrible Nazis are, or they love reading about what a horrible husband Henry VIII was. That seems to be where people are, the general public, with their involvement in history. So there's not a lot of that in my selection. So apologies if you want some recommendations for like an Anne Boleyn biography or something like that. It's not really my bag, so I haven't looked into that much, and I didn't cover it in my degree. I didn't really cover it in my A-level. I did some Tudor stuff when I was at school, but I haven't got a lot of that, to be fair. I have got a... The thing is, a lot of my books on the Reformation are more European than British, so obviously Britain's included, but not just Britain. So these are all about Britain. So there is, my first book I'm going to talk about is about Wales. So it's not that I've ignored Wales, but I haven't got that much on Scotland. So apologies for that, and I haven't got a lot of top-down history. So a lot of this is bottom up. A lot of it is your general public, your poor people, or your peasants, or your or women, or immigrants, that kind of thing. That's where I'm coming from on this video. Right, that said, let's talk about some books. So this is a really interesting book. So I have been reading this for the Historathon, and it's really good. This is A History of Wales by John Davis. I'm trying to get the glare out. History of Wales by John Davis. It's a massive book. It's what is it? 750 pages, and there's lots of maps for the way it's developed, but it goes right from the year dot, and it goes through the centuries, right through to the 20th century, the end of the 20th century. So it really does tell you loads about how Wales battled with England a lot, how certain areas of Wales developed, and the different kind of regions of Wales. It's really, really interesting, and it's really good. So it's really well written. It's well written. A lot of these books, I could easily say they're very readable, and I think that's true. So you could use this for academic purposes, but it's a good kind of popular history book as well. So History of Wales, John Davis. I apologise that there's a bit of a glare there. That's my first book I wanted to talk about. This is another book that goes back but it's a general one that it's got a theme to it, and I think it's really, really good. And I've been sort of a bit occupied by this one recently. So this is The Road Not Taken. So how Britain narrowly missed a revolution. And when I first picked it up, I was assuming it was going to take one event and say that it almost became the kind of impact and power of a revolution. And I thought, well, there's several different events you can look at in that sense and say how sort of fragile the country was in that sense for a sort of revolutionary change. And it's no surprise that I thought there's a few different events you can look at, because that's what this book does. It looks at lots of different events. So it goes right from the Peasants Revolt in 1381 right through to the general strike of the 20th century, the early 20th century general strike, which is really important. So the general strike was when all of the national services went on strike and the country came to a standstill. And it was at a really important moment of protest. And it was I remember studying it thinking, this is crazy, you know, like it really is coming to a head. And you know, we're not at that point yet, but there's lots of striking going on at the moment. But yeah, The Road Not Taken, really good. And just to kind of clarify something, I mean, it talks about, like, this is like a general strike here, but it talks about the Jacobite rebellion and the whole Chartist movement. Although the Chartist movement, you're overstating it, saying it could have been a revolution, but there were lots of people that used the Chartist movement, lots of historians that used that to argue that that England would never have a revolution in modern times. I mean, we did have a revolution in the 17th century, obviously. Some people argue that the War of Roses was a revolution. I don't think it was a revolution, but certainly the Civil War was. But yeah, so that's a really cool one. The Road Not Taken, How Britain Narrowly Missed a Revolution. It is really good. So that's another general one. Right, so we're going to go back in time and take this kind of chronologically after the big old general one on Wales and the big old general one on protest. So this goes back to 1381. There's actually 3 books on this. But like I said, this is an example where I couldn't choose a book. And it is one of my favourite events in history, but it's also linked to something that happened before that's one of my favourite events in history. So one of the things that I've read a lot about and love it, and when it really kind of made me very fascinated when I studied it at school, let alone when I went on to further education, was the Black Death. So the Black Death of the 1340s absolutely decimated Europe. And because of the effects of the Black Death, you had a completely different structure and a completely different balance of power at play. And that is why it's so important what happened with the Peasants Revolt of 1381. It was a really fascinating and important moment where the peasants' demands were so advanced and so daring, so modern, and so bold. So when you look into it, it's fascinating because this was a long time ago. But I will say that my favourite book on it is this one. So I have mentioned this before, The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which is a collection of different sources and commentaries edited by Dobson. And there's loads of stuff on it and loads of things on the individuals involved in the Peasants' Revolt. And it is really, really good. It's difficult to find now, I'd say. But if you can find it, I think that's the one myself. But there's a lot of good ones out there. But it is a really good one. So the Dobson's really, really detailed account of individuals in the Peasants' Revolt is really good. And this is probably the most celebrated one. So any historical scholars, so professional historians, would probably recommend Bondmen Made Free by Rodney Hilton. And it does cover other peasant movements as well as just the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. So it's got like an overview of the new power that peasants had in the 14th century and how they were able to say, well, actually, this is what we want now, and you can't tell us that if we're not happy we can work somewhere else because you need us more than we need you. So that's where this all comes from. And this is a really good book on it. So if you can find Bondmen Made Free, that is really good. And there's a new modern one called England Arise, with the subtitle The People, the King and the Great Revolt of 1381. So the king, I don't know if you know, but the king was really young. So Richard II, the king at the time of the Peasants Revolt, was really young. And I think that's another fascinating element to this. So he was made king at the age of 12. So he wasn't 12 when it happened, but he was very young. And he had lots of advisors around him. And spoilers, he screwed them over royally. Literally, royally. But so it's an interesting... I mean, obviously, I was just about to say it's an interesting story, but it's not just a story because it happened. But it's an interesting series of events. And I just think it's really fascinating. But this is a good book on it. And it's advertised as a new look at it, but it's still very respectful of the boldness of it, and it does argue, like a lot of them do, that it was that the peasants were so forward thinking, and they had a lot to say, a lot to demand, and all that kind of thing. I'm going to go a little bit faster. So this is the kind of exception to the rule for this video. So as I said, there's not a lot of top-down stuff, but I do think that if you're not massively into history, you might not be aware of the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses could be interesting to you if you're interested in Game of Thrones, because George R.R. Martin did base a lot of his sort of political intrigue on the War of the Roses. So this is an actual event that happened where the houses of York and the houses of Lancaster basically battled for supremacy. And basically, it really comes to life in this book. So there's lots of detail about the events that unfolded during the War of the Roses, but it does tap into other things like the printing press being invented, and the ways it had a knock-on effect on the ordinary lives of the people in the areas that were affected by these houses trying to fight for supremacy. And it talks about Richard II a lot, and it talks about Richard III a lot, because it covers most of the 15th century. So it's a really interesting account of a very important part of English history. And yeah, it does say that it doesn't compare to the Civil War, but it does depict the War of Roses as a civil war, but it says it's not as huge in impact. But it's a really interesting book. So War of Roses by Trevor Royal is worth looking at as well. So moving on to the actual Civil War. So again, this is a situation really because it's a very it's a part of English history that I really like. I'm really interested in it, and I've done a lot of studying of it, and I think it's not talked about enough. It could be featured in education a lot more, but anyway, well, I'm talking about the English Civil War. So I'm talking about, if you like, the English Revolution, it sometimes gets called, and predominantly happened in the 1640s. So it kind of built up from the early 1600s and moved in, so that it was pretty much came to a head during the 1640s. And unless you're aware, you might not know that it resulted in the Roundheads winning, and Oliver Cromwell becoming the Protectorate. So he never wanted to be called a king. The Protectorate, and Charles I's head being cut off. So regicide happened in this country. The only time a ruler ever had his head cut off, Charles I, and then later on Cromwell cocked it up, and Charles II came back because Cromwell ended up being quite unpopular, and Charles II came in much more popular. But Charles I was very unpopular, and it caused all sorts of problems in the early 1600s, and it allowed for this civil war to happen. And this is my favourite book on it. There's tons of books on it, and there's loads written by Christopher Hill. It's a little bit of a specialism, for him. And this is the reason why I like this so much is it covers so many of the turmoil of the time and how many radical ideas were coming from different groups. So loads and loads of different groups were talked about here, like not just the Roundheads, but also the Levellers and the Diggers and the Ranters as well. So all sorts of different groups that want different things and are in different positions of power and for different motivations are in this. But it really gives you the sense of England being in an absolute state of disarray and protest and change. So I think it's an amazing book. So if you can get hold of The World Turned Upside Down, it's a fantastic book by Christopher Hill. So there's that one. And then another one by Christopher Hill. And what's good about this one is it's a little bit more about different interpretations of what happened. So it's called Puritanism and Revolution, Interpretations of the Revolution in the 1700s. 17th century, 1600s, by Christopher Hill. A really, really good book. And that picture is a very famous picture of one of the important moments in Parliament at that time. So it's a really important picture as well. But yeah, that's a good one. And then there's a more recent one by Diane Purkis, The English Civil War. And I like this one as well. It's this was written in the 2000s, I think. So a lot of these books were quite old. I think this was written in 2006. Yeah, this was written in 2006. So it's a kind of more recent evaluation of the English Civil War, but it does still. It has a lot of respect for how important the possibility of change was and how bad Charles I's reign was, and how this was a general sense of dissatisfaction, even though obviously it was being led by Parliament, but the people were unhappy. So yeah, there's definitely a really good sense of that in this book. Okay, so moving on, there's a really interesting book that I've been reading about 18th century England, and this is like a general sort of sense of criminality, the violence and disorder in 18th century England, the London mob. It's really good, and it covers the way that thievery happened, and even things like public insults are covered, riots, sort of mob culture, the violence, things like duels and boxing matches, how the law reacted to it all. It's a really good book. So if you manage to find this one, that's really good. London mob, violence and disorder in 18th century England. I love that kind of thing. There's a few books around like that now about the actual kind of machinations of the law and criminality and how it was dealt with. So that's a really good book for sort of the lighter side of that. Oh, I did miss this one out. So before I go too modern, there's Peterloo. So Peterloo is really important because this is it's a really powerful moment during the Chartist movement. So the Chartist movement, just a kind of quick background, the Chartist movement was an attempt to extend the vote to ordinary men. So it would have been too advanced to talk about ordinary women, but ordinary women wanted ordinary men to get the vote as well. So the women that were wives of people that were protesting to try and get the vote were also trying to get the vote for men, because it meant that that household had a vote. And the reality is some of those men would have been hugely influenced or even led by their wives. So that's an element of it. But the extension of the vote was a hugely important moment, and there was lots of and it only happened because of lots of protests and lots of petitions, marches. There was a really famous orator called Henry Hunt, who went around the country trying to stir up feelings of hope to try and change the vote and that kind of stuff. And Peterloo was a moment when basically the authorities panicked and started shooting the people that were gathered to try and get this sort of petition heard, to try and get the change of the vote happen. And it's a really, really important moment of the authorities going a bit crazy and panicking. So Peterloo, if you don't know much about Peterloo, it's a really interesting moment in British history. The story of the Manchester Massacre. There's a really good film, actually, directed by Mike Leigh as well, about the whole thing. So if you fancy that, then that's Peterloo. This one. So Linda Colley, if you find any books by Linda Colley, she's really good. She covers things that are slightly off the beaten track about British history, especially modern British history, and like the 19th and 18th and 19th centuries mostly, but quite thematically, because she looks at British identity a lot, and Britishness, and the empire, and sort of white Britishness. And it's a really interesting set of books that she's written, but this is quite a good one that's been reprinted loads, and I've seen loads of different versions of this. And this is Britain, Empire and the World, 1600 to 1850. So the way that Britain has colonised different places, the impact of that, and the consequences on Britain, all sorts of different things like that. And it's really, really good. So if you can get a chance to read Captives by Linda Colley, it's really good. Or anything by Linda Colley is really good. So yeah, Captives. On that note, this is a really good one as well. So this is called The Invention of Tradition. I really like this. And this is the reason why it sounds like it could be a bit general, but it does focus on Britain. And this is the only mention of Scotland in general in my selection. So apologies to the Scots. But this is the first. There's like an introduction by Eric Hobsbawm. These are all written by different historians, by the way. And then this first one about Scotland is called The Highland Tradition of Scotland. And it kind of covers, it's by Hugh Trevor Roper, who's a really renowned historian. And it talks about the way that Scottish identity, and specifically things like the kilt and the Highland Games and stuff, were all established to kind of solidify that idea of Scottishness. And during the 18th and 19th centuries, it kind of came together. So, and that kind of sets up the whole book, really, because then there's another one after that about Welsh Romanticism, and then there's other things about the British monarchy and how that related to the invention of tradition, and Victorian India, and so the empire's effect on that, and like colonial Africa as well is all part of that sort of idea of Britishness and the British Empire. So it's a really good book on the invention of tradition here. Okay, so this is a big one, and I'd recommend anyone from any political spectrum to read this, because this is just primary sources. Henry Mayhew was there, and this is Henry Mayhew talking about the London Labour and London poor. He walked around London making tons of notes, and you get an absolute sense of London around the time of Dickens. So if you're familiar with Dickens stuff, this is Dickensian London from the man who was there. It's not written as fiction. It's written as non-fiction. It's written as observations, and it's just absolutely amazing. It really is amazing. So if you want to get a sense of what London was like and what England was like in the 19th century, then this is what you want. London Labour and the London Poor. It's really, 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 really good, and essential, I think, for anyone wanting any kind of English history. So, if I was going to pick a few out of this selection, this definitely be one of the first ones I would pick. Okay, similarly, and I do think this is really good, but it kind of takes a different approach, but it's a modern version of this. So Henry Mayhew was there, and Gareth Stedman Jones is looking at different sources to get his conclusions. But this is a study in a relationship between classes in Victorian society. So this is a really good book on the poor and class in Victorian England. So it's really, really good. So Gareth Stedman Jones is a really good writer. I think he writes really well, and his research is brilliant, and he's not afraid to be political about it as well, which is great. And it's not dry. Really good. I really like his way he writes. So Outcast London is a good one from Gareth Stedman Jones. I'm going to talk a bit about immigration for a minute. Who do you think we are? Who do we think we are? Who do we think we are? It's a really good book on immigration, written by an immigrant. She's really good. I've seen her talk on TV a lot as well. So around the early 2000s, she'd appear on like Question Time and on political discussion programs. And she's really sound and interesting and a wise woman. And this is a really good book about immigration. So it covers British Muslims as well as British Sikhs and British Caribbean population as well. All sorts of different immigrants, and talks about the way that their identity doesn't always fit the narrative. And it talks a little bit about feminism in the more sort of ethnic minority communities as well. She does have an issue with some of those terms, by the way, as well, she talks about. But it's just a really interesting book that I definitely recommend. And that cover is amazing, and having the Queen being made to the occasion is fantastic. So yeah, Who Do We Think We Are is a really, really good book on immigration. I mean, I don't know if it's still available because I've had it a long time, but it's really good. And then this is a really good book on the suffragettes. So I can't do this kind of long video on British history without talking about suffragettes, and this is a really good one, and it kind of brings lots of things together as well. So it does give you a really good overview with lots of detail as well, and I think it's a really good book. So Diane Atkinson is the author, Remarkable Lives of Suffragettes, and it's got lots of detail about the individuals involved in the suffragette movement and the process as well. So the different moments where they sort of made steps forward or made steps back, and the relationships between different elements of Britain within the suffragette movement. So it's really good. So Rise Up Women is a good one for looking at the suffragettes. And one last one, which is one of the more recent ones I've read, but it's really good, Black Victorians, Hidden in History. This is really interesting because there are a few books out there about older Britain with the black community in it, but this takes this like literally hones in on individuals, and it looks like individuals that were artists or that were soldiers or that were scientists or political thinkers. There's all sorts of different people that this book hones in on, and it's more about looking at these individual people, and I think it's kind of interesting. So it's a little bit different. It's not an overview, and there are some that are more overviews, but I think it's a really good book. So Black Victorians, Hidden in History by David Lammy, MP. So yeah, really good book. There we are. So that's a big bunch of books about British history. I've covered lots of different periods, lots of different events, but there's so much I haven't covered, obviously, because it's a very long history. But hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you found something in that lot that you might find interesting. Apologies if it's a bit long, but, you know, it covers a lot of time. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye.